Hello, welcome to Monday. Great thing about online class. Again, I mentioned this earlier in the semester. You can come up to work dressed any way you want, do the class, and assuming you're watching it in any way you want. Also, a couple things to go over. So we have one more final written assignment, really easy one here to finish out the semester. Also, your final project due on the day that your Thursday, which would be the day of your final. Um, I believe it's Thursday would have been the day of your final. Also, your test coming up. So a busy week as we finish this out. Been a great um, couple of weeks, almost 6 weeks. Uh, we talked early in the semester about principle of past performance. So this is why what I'm about to tell you shouldn't surprise me, but it does somewhat. So principle of past performance is basically if you get what you've always gotten, you're always gonna you're always gonna get basically the same thing. So last summer session I did a video drop in during our lectures about 20 minutes in, said, hey, if you're watching this, send me an email, just say I saw it, and you get 5 points. So we had 20 people in the class last summer session, and two saw it and responded. So here this summer session 2 we have 16. One person watched and saw it. Now, Ashley, way to go, Ashley! Congratulations. So again, as I look at these things, we're not even making these lectures very long. They have to be, you should be, if you're in a class, we'd be in here for 1 hour and 50 minutes. I understand you're not going to sit and watch a lecture that long. So I'm trying to make the lectures fairly short. And you still don't watch 20 minutes in. So it makes me a little less interested in much of a curve for the next test, which is test 2 and our last test. I have your class participation in probably by Wednesday. I've got all of your assignments graded so far. I've had 2 projects turned in. You don't have to turn them in yet. So if you have a project turned in, kudos to you for getting it in early. I've got 2 of those graded, so ready to go. Let's get into today's lecture. This on the video on Friday about news in the internet, but just want to go over some of these different changes in how news has been covered over the years, encompassing all of electronic media. Starting in 1963, John Kennedy was the president. He was assassinated in Dallas, and there was a lot of TV coverage of that, and that was the birth of people turning to TV for their news, turning to their favorite announcer or anchor, somebody they could trust, somebody that they knew, somebody that they relied on for news. And as you may or may not know, and hopefully you do know, that after the um, assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald had assassinated the president. Then you had on television Jack Ruby come out of the crowd and kill Lee Harvey Oswald. So all of that seen on news. So in 1963, people really started focusing on TV news, and that's where they turned to get their news coverage. Now you're going to be going online to look for those things, but in '63, that's where we went to television. So speaking of television, at the time you had really well-known, trusted television anchors that you relied on, that you got all your news from, and CBS relied for years and years on Walter Cronkite, then Dan Rather, and we talked about Dan Rather in class on Friday, but Walter Cronkite was seen as grandfatherly type, trustworthy type. This is well before the allegations of misinformation from the media. And so he went to Vietnam in 1968, and his thoughts, his coverage, his way of delivering the news changed public opinion on Vietnam in 1968. So you saw then that your news people could be change makers as far as opinion. Love this picture here of the Pope. I should know which Pope this is, but in 1969, this is our third Pope viewing on slides throughout the semester. But the moon landing, and you saw how again a big event could really get people interested in television, and television provided something that you didn't have previous, which was you could see it happening, you see the pictures, you could get descriptions, you could do all these different things that we all know about television, that we love about television. You see, I love the stand here. You guys probably remember, you've even had this in class where they would roll out a TV or a monitor so you can watch videos in class, and so they did that there for the Pope in 1969. My next class, I'm going to know the name of that Pope. I always, every year I go through that, and now I'm going to change it. Newspaper found its way again in 1974. Watergate, Richard Nixon, he was eventually forced to resign. Gerald Ford, who was the vice president, after Spiro Agnew, who had been the vice president, was forced out for other issues, tax issues and other things. Nixon resigns, and we saw then that newspaper may be finding themselves back a little bit after losing some audience to television, that this is the way they could really make a dent and an impact, and that is with investigative reporting. You know, the Washington Post, and rightfully so, gets a lot of great accolades for their handling of Watergate. All the President's Men, which is a great movie. Um, you saw Bernstein and Woodward, who still today are talked to, and people visit with them about different political issues. But New York Times was also right there with them, and the Washington Post got into it primarily because it was competitive, right? They're competing with each other. They're trying for advertising dollars. They're trying for all the things that we talked about all semester long for business. Change news coverage. 1979 started Nightline. This was, you had the Iran hostage crisis. So some Americans were held hostage by what was going on in Iran, and Ted Koppel began a nightly news show called Nightline. Again, this seems almost hard to imagine because now everywhere you go, there's news, there's coverage. If you want to stay up all night when there's a bombing or there's some kind of a tragedy, you can, because CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, they're all got all night coverage. But at the time those places didn't exist, news would have, you might be on sometime during prime time. You would have your local news on from 10 to 10:30, maybe a little longer. Well, Nightline decided, hey, so many people are interested in this that they began coverage after what was the local news. They would come back on and have more coverage of what was happening in Iran. And it really became very successful, made Ted Koppel's career. That show lasted for many years. 1986 was really where you saw something disastrous happen live on camera, and that was the Challenger space shuttle. Classrooms around the country, elementary classrooms and all this, just like we saw with the television with the Pope, probably wheeled in their monitor, hey, let's watch what's going on. And then, of course, we had the disaster happen right in front of our very eyes. And again, power of television, that people could see that and watch it and see it as it unfolded. We saw this again on 9/11 in 2001, where people really, television became so compelling. And we talked about it on Friday. The internet was great. People could get really live updates on what was happening. But television was still compelling for as it happens, watching it. The internet, as we watched on the video the other day, wasn't ready for the traffic. They had a hard time with the web traffic. And so it made them change the way they do business a little bit as well. This is primarily a change to radio, a change in the fairness doctrine, and you see Rush Limbaugh there, and he really took off after that. But the fairness doctrine was alleviated a little bit in 1987, and alleviated to the point where it used to be that if Rush Limbaugh was going to spend 2 hours just hammering on a political candidate or a political party or something, you would have to give the other party equal time. Well, that was changed, and that really gave birth to the start of talk radio, shock jock radio, those type of things. With the change in the fairness doctrine, that changed how news was covered back in that day. In 1991, we had the first Iraq War, Persian Gulf War, and again, it became like programming. I remember this like it was yesterday. I don't remember this particular shot. You see him on the phone. I think that's Bob Simon is his name. Love the phone there that he's reporting from. And obviously technology has come a long way in those 26 years. But I remember this where when I came home from work, we would turn on the war. It became like a show. It'd be see what's happening in the war. And this was the first real opportunity. Now we saw again on Friday where in eventual war over there in that area about the blogger and how the internet really became a part of that, where in this war you didn't have that, but in the next one you had the Baghdad blogger talking about what was happening as it was happening and reporting as a citizen, and that later on we saw embedded journalists going over with troops and inside units and things like that. But this was really the start of that in 1991, where it was live, coming to you live. In 1994, the restrictions were loosened and cameras were allowed in for the O.J. Simpson trial. So we have video from everything that happened in the O.J. trial, and it opened up a whole new world of court TV on television, all those things. That all changed in 1994. Now you have shows dedicated to that. We talked about this on the internet. It changed the internet. Also, the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky story, where there was a time when dalliances that the president might have or might not have sometimes would be known by the media, but they covered it up, helped them cover it up, like they'd all be in concert together. At this time, we realized things are changing. We're going to go out. The media is going to cover this in such a way that it showed how competitive everything was. We saw this with the internet when we talked about the internet the other day, and then television was involved. It consumed the news, and all of a sudden, politicians treated as celebrities became very, very much in vogue. I mentioned this earlier, 9/11, 2001, the video of the plane hitting the buildings, the planes hitting the building, the ensuing coverage, the everything from that. And these were game changers for both television and for internet coverage. Also, to an extent, to radio, as people were talking about it. It's also very, very much iconic in the fact about misinformation. And we saw that on Friday. Radio stations especially reporting early on, hey, there's a little plane hit the tower. Hey, this is happening. People didn't really know, right? We didn't know what was happening. And the news coverage really got caught up in that. So all changed on 9/11. 2007, Virginia Tech. We had the shooting at Virginia Tech. And again, maybe one of the very first times where it was able to be handled. And the people at Virginia Tech now make a living going around talking about crisis communications and how things were handled and how they got the message to students, how they got the message to parents. But people were flocking to the internet about what was going on at Virginia Tech and how that was covered. So there's just some of those iconic times again. And, we had this as a discussion board topic. Where do you go for news when something big is happening? And obviously now the internet is very much telling about that's where most people go. The internet allows you, we talked about this a lot during the semester. I'm going to try to make it a test question. Community, that you can share your thoughts, you can share your concerns, you can share your grief with other people. Where if you're watching television, you're watching or listening to the radio, unless it's a call-in show, you don't have that opportunity. You just have to kind of wallow in your own setting. I talked about hosting a show on the radio when Mike Leach was fired at Texas Tech, a very, very popular head coach in Texas Tech history. He's fired the day before, or a couple days before a bowl game, for things happening beyond what was happening here. On the field. But Coach Leach gets fired. Fans are up in arms. And what did they do? They took to the radio to comment. Now, yeah, they also took to the internet, where they could post their feelings and post their sentiments and post, again, anger and all those things. But radio also gave them that opportunity. And this is why I think local radio always has a place a little bit in what we're doing, because there was a sense of community. Again, I'm going to call and I want to share. And even though they're all calling basically saying the same thing, I still, to this day, have people telling me, hey, I wouldn't have gotten through that whole Mike Leach thing if it hadn't been for your radio show. I actually was with one of the Tech coaches on an airplane, and a person just came up to me out of the blue to say, hey, we were with you the entire time during the Mike Leach firing. Think about that. That was 9 years ago, and it's still 8 years ago, still on people's minds, and that part of it was compelling enough for people to think about. So I just want to give you some just changes in news coverage, and we talked about some of this on Friday. Again, Facebook. People get their news from Facebook. And it's interesting if you look at some of these. Some people get their news from Twitter. Some people get their news from LinkedIn. Some people get their news from YouTube, which all of that is somewhat fascinating to me. But the change in now where we're getting our news, and the video or the slides we saw on Friday talked about people want to get their news from people that they like or care about. Younger people anyway. They care about their colleagues and what their colleagues are telling them. So social media has become a pathway to news coverage. And this is back from a survey 4 years ago from the Pew Research Center. So we probably need to even update this. So again, going back 4 years, percentage of U.S. adults who get news on social networking sites and also get news often on traditional news platforms. So 21% of Facebook users, 21% of print newspaper users still looked at Facebook. They looked at YouTube. They looked at LinkedIn. And primarily the biggest number there is LinkedIn. What does that tell you? Again, older audience, kind of audience is going to read a newspaper. Local TV, see again, 42% Facebook, 48% Google+, 37% LinkedIn. All adults on all of these, if you look at, clearly people in the older demographics are going to be people that go across all chapters, all mediums, cable, radio, local TV, print newspaper. Your group is not going to be interested in print newspaper at all. Percentage of social networking site users who have shared or reposted stories, images, or videos. So half of the people, this again was in 2014, half of the people who use social media have shared or reposted news stories, images, or videos. I know I have. I've said, hey, this is an interesting story, posted it. When was the last time anyone has ever, in the history of ever, looked at a news story that is different from what they think and said, you know what, I've changed my mind? It's never happened, but people still do that. 46% have discussed a news issue or event. 14% have posted a photo they took at a news event. That number will be higher now, I'm sure. Citizen journalism, we talked about that the other day, and posted videos of a news event that they were at. 12%. Again, that number would be higher. Everyone now thinks of themselves as a bit of a journalist, or they can be a journalist. And so it has definitely changed the way all of us have consumed our news, but also participate in our news. These things become participatory now where they didn't used to. Kinds of news you see on Facebook. This, again, from 2013. This number would be a lot different now because I think we saw what happened with the election, the presidential election in 2016, that social media really played a big part in that. But 73% of Facebook news consumers regularly saw entertainment news on their Facebook feed. 65% saw people and events in their community. 57% saw sports. We'd like to make that higher because we really hit sports hard on Facebook at Texas Tech. There's national government and politics, 55%. Crime, 51%. All the way down to business at 31%. A big word we just always need to remember that all these things really combine is community. That's why you see more things about crime, things you see about community, because people are posting it. There's neighborhood sites. There's different organizations that have people discussing, hey, what's going on in their neighborhood. It's community. And that's where Facebook can really be a big part of what news coverage and how news coverage is presented. So here's a question the Pew Research Center did in 2013. If the topic of government surveillance programs came up in these settings, how willing would you to be join in at a conversation? Very willing, somewhat unwilling, very unwilling. So at a family dinner, 75% of people would be willing to talk about government surveillance programs. Leads to a lot of people storming out mad at Thanksgiving. Government, politics, religion, just can't get away with that. At a restaurant with friends, 71%. At a community meeting, 68%, which of course you're probably at a community meeting for that. 66% at work. And this is very willing or somewhat willing to discuss something like this. Interestingly enough, at this time in 2013, only 43% on social media, only 41% on Twitter. It's an interesting dynamic. I guess the thought there is, hey, when you're at family or you're with friends, people know what you think. They understand, hey, John is really liberal. But John may have some people on Facebook that doesn't want to know that about him. So, out today's lecture. So, one of them being, again, there's a lot of so whats into what we're talking about because overall we want to talk about as managers, and this, again, a management class, what are we doing with these numbers? So one of them we can show you is local viewership of television news. So here you see, based on this, that morning news programs have remained pretty constant. Right about across the board over the last 8 or 9 years, nationally, about 10 million people watch the local news show, whatever that would be. And most of the stations here in town have one. And a lot of that is just out of creature of habit, right? You get up in the morning, you start getting ready for work, you turn the television on, it's on the background, it's white noise. It hasn't changed a lot. The number in 2007 looks to be about the exact same it was in 2015. But if you look up the other two numbers, both of them dropping, one of them more of a precipitous drop, and that is late night local news. It has dropped quite a bit from 30 million in 2007 to less than 25 million in 2015. Evening news has dropped a little bit. It's had maybe one increase there from 2013 to where we are now, but still overall a drop from where it was in 2007. So the so what is, how do you treat that? At one time, when I used to sell television advertising, well, the late night news, you charge quite a bit more than you did than the the 5:30 news or the 6 o'clock news. Well, now how do you justify that? The numbers are about the same as they were at that time, so it's different. But morning news hasn't changed, so you have to be able to look at those things and say, what are we doing? What are we doing with this information? Advertising revenue and what we're interested in. This is for local television stations in 2013 and 2015, and I've got the answer up there for you at the top, the reason that might be. 2012 and 2014 were election years. And so, as you can see, advertising, like war, is big business for television stations and for media altogether. People are watching the news more, they're paying attention more to the news, and advertisers are spending more money. And the advertisers, primarily in 2012 and 2014, that are changing those dollars are politicians. Politicians are advertising, whether it's a local race, whether it's a regional race, or whether it's a national race, where they're spending local dollars. So again, it's great business for television stations, and this is what we're looking at television, to have an election. Have an election, buy some advertising. It's the American way. What are we all here for? We're here for a job, right? You want to work, and most of you do not want to work in news, but maybe one or two of you do. And so there's some encouraging numbers in this, and this is the median salary in the United States in local news. This isn't a statistics class, but we do know mean means the average of all the salaries combined. You take the total salary dollars, divide it by the number of news directors, and the answer is the mean, the average. The median is the number that's right exactly in the middle. So in this case, the news director averages about, it appears to be on this number, somewhere like $92,000. So that means half the news directors in the news industry in the United States make more than that, half make less than that in talking about local news. And that's gone up. When you look at a year before that, these are 2013, 2014 numbers, closer to 80,000 back in 2013. So the dollars are going out. The assistant news director, the same thing. Dollar amount is going up. Anchors for the news, the average salary is going up a little bit. Managing editor salary is going down, and a lot of the times it's because of managing editor. A lot of local stations don't have what's called a managing editor, but again, in this age of multi-purpose and multi-platform and being able to do a lot of different things, somebody who's the managing editor, it's a very specialized job. Hey, I'm just going to manage the newscast. Well, maybe those dollars are spent elsewhere. So that changes. Same for an executive producer. Same thing, that we're asking our people, our talent in some cases, to do more, and so you pay less for some of those jobs. Person doing the weather now, the average weather person in the United States makes $60,000, up from about $57,000 in 2013. So we talked about this a couple times. Sports is less and less important in local news. It just isn't that important. You can be really good at your job, but it doesn't matter because there's only so many dollars that a local station is going to spend on that. Now we're seeing the average salary for the sports anchor going down, closer to $40,000 a year now. Is mid-40s prior to that, and I would imagine a couple years from now that'll be even lower. The rest of the jobs, news producer, graphic design person, all about the same. Reporters, the salary is going up a little bit, and that's again for what we talked about for the multi-purpose part. If you can shoot, you can edit, you can do a lot of these things yourself. You don't need some of these other positions, so that allows more money for you. News writer did the same thing. We expect our talent now to do some of that themselves. I think this is interesting. We've heard this a lot recently about podcasts. Podcasts have become really much more in vogue these days. The percentage of U.S. adults age 12 and older who have listened to a podcast just in the past month, and in 2016 it was more than 20%. In 2008, it was less than 10%. So you can see, except for a drop there from 2012 to 2013, podcasts have grown a little bit in popularity. How about persons who have just listened to a podcast overall. They have just tuned into a podcast. Close to 40% now of people 12 plus have listened to a podcast sometime in their life, 10% in 2006. So over the last 10 years, that has grown nearly 400%. So what does that mean? Again, if you're looking at that, you're saying, wow, podcasts have really become more popular. Well, amongst established legacy media organizations, you'll see the New York Times in March of last year announced the creation of a podcast team focused on news and opinion programming. Again, they're looking at ways to say not as many people are taking the print publication, but how can we reach these people? Podcast may be a way to do that. This is a public broadcasting station, WNYC, and this was back in October of 2015, and announced its plan to raise $15 million in funds for a podcast division. And we had a public broadcasting fact sheet for my in-person class because we did a project on public broadcasting. But it's become the rage for public broadcasting. You see a lot of people now getting into the mix. There was a story on NBC about these prisoners who started podcasts. We might watch that on our Wednesday class. Podcasting is public broadcasting, just like everyone else. Public broadcasting trying to make money, so they find a way that might work. The Wall Street Journal announced podcast in December of 2015, and you may be thinking, sure, the Wall Street Journal and public broadcasting, New York Times. The Des Moines Register, small local paper, turned to a long-form narrative podcast in order to explore one story in depth at work. They do it more often. And think about that. So if somebody came in and was doing an expose on something involved with Texas Tech athletics, and they interviewed me, they might take 2 or 3 of what I said, 2 or 3 bites of what I said, and incorporate it into that story. If they had a podcast, they could say, hey, for more on this, go to our podcast and hear the entire interview with Robert Giovanetti. So podcast gives you a chance to unpack the story a little bit more. And we'll see more and more of that, I think, going forward. People do still listen to the radio. Percentage of Americans age 12 and older who have listened to online radio in the past month, and radio, just like everyone else, is still struggling to find what is its role. And they've realized, they being local radio stations, they've realized that, hey, the internet can be our friend, right? We can have a web page where people can learn about our personalities and enroll in different prizes we're giving or contests we're doing, but also they can stream the radio. They can stream what they're doing, and so people can still hear it. They can listen to it in their office when in the past they might not have been listening to it. You know, you get in your car, you get out of the car. It used to be a great compliment to people who hosted a talk show. Hey, I stayed in my car to listen to your interview. Now you can go into your office and listen to it online. They can listen to it. They can stream it online. So online radio has helped local radio. And people do still listen to cars. Traditional AM FM radio is by a large margin the most common form of in-car listening. Pew did this research. Just 8% of listeners in the car named online radio as the source they used most often. 12% named satellite radio, and that would be, obviously Sirius XM and the like. 63% that they talked to named AM FM as the audio source they turn to most often. Part of it because of my job, part of it because I have satellite radio in my car, but I generally will listen to local radio when I'm in the car. In radio revenue, they're still struggling a little bit. They get some dollars out of digital radio. They get some dollars if they're part of a network of some sort. They get their network compensation. They get some dollars from off-air things like promotions and other things that they might do with their advertisers, different things they might do on site with the advertisers. But primarily, and we know this when we talked about sales, spot advertising is still the primary revenue generator for radio. So people buying spots, car dealerships, restaurants, everyone else, those dollars are the primary revenue source for radio. We haven't talked much about magazines. Again, if you're Newsweek, if you're Time, if you're whomever, if a big event happens on a Tuesday and your magazine comes out on Thursday, guess what? Your magazine is not going to have the story. So, like we talked about podcasts, newspapers have to become more of unpacking the stories, telling the stories in a longer format, talking more about personalities and things of that nature. And so, again, magazines, might have been saying newspapers, but magazines um, have seen a dip in their overall circulation. Not much. It's remained fairly steady, but it's not what it once was if we had looked at this from example for the 1990s. So again, the message for you on all of this should be this. You should always think, so what? This is great numbers. So what? I get social media numbers all the time from my people. And my first question is almost, so what? What are we going to do with this? Only 3% watch our videos on Twitter for the full length of the video. Well, so what if we're not going to do anything if we're still putting them out? The only thing that makes sense is if we do something different with it. So hopefully that's what you can look at this and say, okay, if I'm a news director, if I'm a general manager, I know we're going to put some money into some podcasts. I know that we're not going to spend a lot of money in sports if I'm a local television station, unless you say, hey, I see an opening. People aren't in Lubbock, Texas, for example. Texas Tech puts out a lot of its own news. So that's why people don't necessarily care as much about sports on television, on your news station. But you could do what Channel 11 and Pete Christie have done. You can say, okay, we realize the tech market is pretty much flooded and saturated. We're going to do high schools. We're going to concentrate on high schools. Then it makes sense. Smart management. You look at the trends, you look at the information, and you decide what you are going to do with it. Lots of things in today's lecture are things we're going to have in the test, the final test. Community. The sense of community means a lot to an electronic media operation. Different things like that you can pick from the lecture if you listen to it, that I stress over and over again. Dual product market, community, another good one. However those things are packaged, it's beyond what we're talking about just in our slides.